When organized crime was handed a golden opportunity called Prohibition, it seized it with ruthless precision, creating a criminal empire that would alter the course of history. These men weren't just bootleggers, they were architects of a sprawling underworld infrastructure that reached into every facet of American life. With the billions earned from illegal liquor, they built networks controlling transportation, docks, laborers, vehicles, real estate, and more. Prohibition wasn't merely a crime spree. It was the blueprint for an alternative government that could rival the official one. Recognizing the needs of their illicit trade, they expanded into farming to secure wheat for distilleries, worked with suppliers for molasses, and acquired properties to store their contraband. To distribute liquor across the nation, they invested in trucks, ships, and even influenced the construction of new roads. Their reach extended to docks and shipping lines, where they gained control over workers, ensuring every aspect of the supply chain served their enterprise. Over time, these criminals transformed themselves into shadowy moguls, manipulating politics and infrastructure to facilitate their operations. Prohibition ended, but their dominance only grew. Roosevelt's push into the Second World War ignited an economic boom, breathing life into old industries and creating new ones. Organized crime rode this wave, becoming richer and more entrenched. Men like Tony Accardo, Russell Bufalino, Tommy Lucchese, Santo Trafficante Junior, Carlos Marcello, Joe Zerilli, Tony Provenzano, Dave Beck, Jimmy Hoffa, and Carlo Gambino emerged as multimillionaires. The Mafia's influence infiltrated unions, leveraging their control to dominate industries, from automotive manufacturing to casinos. Workers gained better rights, but the real winners were the mobsters, who held the companies and their employees in their iron grip. In Detroit, industrialists like Henry Ford relied on organized crime to keep unions out. But the mob soon realized that unionization was a double-edged sword. By controlling both workers and management, they gained unprecedented power. They organized unions for bakers, carpenters, roofers, and truck drivers. Even in casinos, they installed unions for waitstaff, dancers, laundry workers, and food service employees. With a simple shutdown of these unions, they could bring entire industries to their knees. Through the Teamsters Pension Fund, they built and controlled massive projects, including their own casinos. But this power came under scrutiny as revelations about their activities began to surface. In January 1963, Senator McClellan spearheaded a series of newspaper articles exposing the depth of corruption within unions, particularly the Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa. Within 2 years, Hoffa, whose power once rivaled the President of the United States, was imprisoned, stripped of his title, and his empire left vulnerable. Jimmy Hoffa was no ordinary labor leader. His influence extended from boardrooms to back alleys, where his word could mean life or death. His infamous line, "I heard you paint houses," was a euphemism for murder. Hoffa's Teamsters controlled industries with an iron fist, while figures like Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Santo Trafficante in Florida, and Russell Bufalino in Pennsylvania served as his dark allies. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just an ally of organized crime, he was practically woven into its fabric. Sharing more than just alliances, Hoffa relied on the same legal muscle as the underworld's elite. He shared attorneys with Carlos Marcello, the formidable boss of New Orleans, and Santo Trafficante, the kingpin of Florida's criminal empire. Among them was Frank Regano, Trafficante's trusted lawyer, who also represented Hoffa in some of his most pivotal battles. Further tightening these connections, Hoffa counted on the services of William Bufalino, cousin to the ever-elusive Russell Bufalino, the silent power behind the Pennsylvania crime family. This legal network was more than a convenience. It was a symbol of Hoffa's deep integration into the criminal underworld. He wasn't merely an associate, he was an equal, moving within the same circles as the most powerful mafia figures in America. These ties exemplified the symbiotic relationship between Hoffa's union empire and organized crime, a web so intricate that it blurred the lines between legitimate labor movements and the sinister machinations of the mob. Jimmy Hoffa's connections to the legal world extended far beyond mere representation. They reflected the deep alliances between organized labor and organized crime. Two key figures in this network were Jack Wasserman and Irving Davidson, both of whom were trusted attorneys for Carlos Marcello, the feared boss of New Orleans. Hoffa frequently relied on their expertise, cementing his ties to Marcello's formidable empire. Irving Davidson wasn't just a lawyer, he was a power broker. One of Marcello's most vital contacts, Davidson moved effortlessly between the underworld and the corridors of influence. He maintained an extraordinarily close relationship with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, dining with him almost every weekend at Hoover's favorite restaurants. This connection provided Marcello, and by extension, Hoffa, with a degree of insulation from federal scrutiny that few could rival. Jack Wasserman, meanwhile, was a key figure in navigating the legal troubles of other mob heavyweights. He was instrumental in helping Russell Bufalino, the shadowy boss of the Pennsylvania crime family, fight his deportation battles. Wasserman's dual loyalty to Marcello and Bufalino underscored the intricate web of relationships that linked Hoffa to the most powerful mafia families in America. These attorneys didn't just represent their clients in court. They were conduits of influence, ensuring that the criminal elite remained protected and their empires intact. However, cracks in the foundation began to show. Edward Grady Partin, a Louisiana Union leader, turned informant and exposed Hoffa's threats to Robert Kennedy. Hoffa assumed Partin was connected to Marcello, underestimating the fractured nature of Marcello's influence. While Marcello controlled what he chose, he often left unions outside his core interests, creating an opening for federal investigations. These revelations fueled Kennedy's relentless pursuit of organized crime. The tension between Hoffa and Kennedy reached a boiling point in a notorious confrontation. Hoffa, kept waiting for over 20 minutes by Kennedy, erupted into fury. When the Attorney General finally arrived, his casual demeanor, dog leash in hand, pushed Hoffa over the edge. In a fit of rage, Hoffa pinned Kennedy against the wall, snarling threats to kill him and his family. Only the intervention of Frank Ragano and Frank Sheeran prevented a physical assault from escalating further. This volatile encounter set the stage for an all-out war between Hoffa, Kennedy, and the web of alliances that included Cuban exiles, the CIA, and powerful mob bosses. Hoffa's influence wasn't confined to America. In the late 1940s, he defied a U.S. weapons embargo to smuggle arms to Israel, a story later confirmed by his son, who expressed pride in his father's actions. Yet, Hoffa's international dealings further highlighted the duality of organized crime's power. It could undermine nations while pursuing their own interests. As McClellan's articles unfolded in early 1963, they revealed the depth of corruption, exposing the Union ties to mobsters like Marcello, Trafficante, and Bufalino. Hoffa's empire was unraveling, but the fallout went beyond unions. By the end of that year, John F. Kennedy would be assassinated, leaving America to grapple with the shadowy conglomerate of power, corruption, and violence that had infiltrated every corner of society. In this installment, McClellan recounts how the International Brotherhood of Teamsters set the stage for their own scrutiny by the Senate. Beginning with an unassuming West Coast inquiry by Chief Counsel Robert Kennedy, now serving as Attorney General, in December of 1956, the investigation unearthed alarming evidence of corruption. Informants and sworn testimony revealed that Frank Brewster, head of the Western Conference of Teamsters in Seattle, had been misusing union funds. The Teamsters, however, did not yield easily to the Senate's probing. Union officials defiantly refused to produce critical records, repeatedly questioned the jurisdiction of the permanent subcommittee, and applied persistent pressure on members of Congress to redirect oversight of their activities to the more lenient Senate Labor Committee. Their defiance ultimately bolstered the resolve of the Select Committee, which would go on to shake the very foundations of the Teamsters' tarnished reputation. Quick developments during the West Coast trip provided valuable leads that caught the attention of Robert Francis Kennedy, focusing it on Dave Beck, the high-ranking leader of the Teamsters Union. Amid the mounting scrutiny, the Teamsters were already embroiled in a fierce internal power struggle. James Riddle Hoffa was relentlessly pursuing the presidency, positioning Beck as a dispensable figure. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Beck's personal financial records concealed a complex web of manipulations involving Teamster funds used for his own profit and gain. Adding to the intrigue, a man named Nathan Shefferman, a labor relations counsel based in Chicago, was believed to hold vital records documenting Beck's questionable operations. These revelations intensified the investigation, paving the way for deeper probes into the Teamsters' leadership and their alleged corruption. Robert Francis Kennedy and the committee's chief accountant, Carmine Bellino, shifted their focus from Frank Brewster and flew to Chicago to subpoena Nathan Shefferman's records. What they uncovered in those records was staggering. Dave Beck, the top officer of the most powerful union in the United States, earned an annual salary of $50,000, enjoyed an unlimited expense account, and lived rent-free in a Seattle house, valued at $163,000. This house had been constructed using Teamster funds, which Beck later sold to the union, allowing him to reside there at no personal expense. Effectively, Beck had turned the Teamster Treasury into his personal bank account. Through Nathan Shefferman, Beck used union funds for an array of personal expenditures, including $1,918.15 for gardening, $2,159.77 for landscaping, and $354 for 12 pairs of binoculars. Other purchases included ties and shirts, costing $192.65, 2 aluminum boats for $196.50, and 3 mattresses with springs for $222.69. The extravagance extended to an array of items: coats, ties, undershirts, a radio, golf balls, golf clubs, sheets, pillowcases, football tickets, 21 pairs of nylons, 5 dozen diapers, typewriters, outboard motors, furniture, a deep freezer, a vacuum cleaner, a rifle, and countless other goods, totaling approximately $85,000. All of it had been systematically siphoned from the Teamster Treasury. When Robert Kennedy confronted Beck about records suggesting he had embezzled $35,000 of Teamster funds, Beck was speechless. Kennedy then presented him with a letter, signed by Senator John McClellan, chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The letter summoned Beck to hearings in January 1957 to address charges of fund misuse. Beck's reaction was fury. "You'll hear about this," he snapped, and he made good on his threat. The Teamsters quickly mobilized, applying immense pressure. Banks holding the union's extensive treasury refused to release financial records. Crucial documents vanished from Teamster offices, while others were altered or tampered with to obscure their contents. The Teamsters' resistance escalated, with defiance becoming their strategy. At the initial hearings, Frank Brewster refused to answer questions, with his lawyers arguing that the subcommittee lacked jurisdiction. The barriers of obstruction were rising, signaling the lengths the union was willing to go to shield its secrets. Einar Mohn, executive secretary to Dave Beck, issued a directive through a telegram sent to all Teamster vice presidents, instructing them to refuse to answer any questions posed by the Senate committee. This bold maneuver sent a clear signal. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters was openly challenging the authority of the federal government. The Senate wasted no time in responding. An 8-member bipartisan committee, officially named the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field, was swiftly established. This Select Committee was tasked with investigating corruption and misconduct within both labor and management sectors. The committee's composition reflected its bipartisan foundation. It included 4 Democratic senators: John Kennedy of Massachusetts, Sam Ervin Jr. of North Carolina, Pat McNamara of Michigan, and John McClellan of Arkansas. The Republican members were Senators Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, Irving Ives of New York, Carl Munt of South Dakota, and Barry Goldwater of Arizona. On the afternoon of January 30, 1957, the Senate unanimously voted to approve the formation of the Select Committee. Backed by a $350,000 appropriation, the committee was granted the authority to delve into corruption and improper practices in the labor and management sectors. The Teamsters, by repeatedly claiming the Senate had overstepped its jurisdiction in prior investigations, had unintentionally ensured their own heightened scrutiny. With a specific mandate now secured from the Senate, the Select Committee was fully empowered to proceed, making the defiant Teamsters their primary focus. The Teamsters became the primary focus of the Senate Select Committee in 1957, not because they were the largest union in the nation or due to any preconceived effort to undermine unionism. In truth, the committee initially had no idea of the extent of corruption within major unions. The Teamsters drew attention by openly challenging the authority of the United States Senate, a defiance that could not be ignored. The committee's first hearings revealed a disturbing web of crime and vice in Portland, Oregon, where Teamster officials and local civil authorities had colluded to corrupt the city. At the heart of this criminal network was James Elkins, a notorious racketeer and seasoned gambler who wielded immense influence over the city's underworld. Elkins had a lengthy police record that included violations during the Prohibition-era and a prison sentence of 20 to 30 years for assault with intent to kill. By the early years of the last decade, he had risen to prominence as Portland's pinball king, solidifying his status as a dominant figure in West Coast organized crime. However, his fortunes took a turn when he began to deal with the Teamsters, setting the stage for a dramatic clash between organized labor and organized crime. Eventually, James Elkins became so consumed with fear for his own safety and future that he resorted to secretly recording conversations to document the full extent of the sordid conspiracy. Among the events he recounted was a chilling encounter with Frank Brewster, head of the Western Conference of Teamsters, during a meeting in Seattle. Elkins described the meeting vividly. As near as I can remember it, I came into his room and sat down in his little waiting room. 3 men came in, looked me over for a couple of minutes, and then left. Then he came in. He said, "I'm going to tell you to start with, I don't like the people you represent." I said, "I don't represent any people, just Jim Elkins." "Nothing scares me," he said. "I make mayors, and I break mayors. I make chiefs of police, and I break chiefs of police. I have been in jail, and I have been out of jail. There is nothing that scares me." He got red in the face and said, "If you bother my 2 boys, if you embarrass my 2 boys, you will find yourself wading across Lake Washington with a pair of concrete boots." Brewster later dismissed Elkins's account as a fantastic story and denied the allegations. The men Elkins was dealing with included 2 Seattle gamblers, McLaughlin and Maloney, whose operations were bankrolled by Teamster funds. These gamblers envisioned reorganizing the city's underworld into a more efficient, profit-driven enterprise. Their first step was to dominate Portland's pinball operations, deploying Teamster pickets to blockade deliveries of essentials like bread, milk, and beer to storekeepers who refused to comply. Elkins initially cooperated with their plans, but he drew the line when the Combine proposed introducing organized prostitution into the city. Recognizing the danger he faced, Elkins took precautions, installing a tape recorder with a microphone capable of capturing conversations held in Tom Maloney's apartment, where the conspirators frequently met. Elkins recorded 70 hours of incriminating conversations, which ultimately exposed the conspiracy and its bid to control Portland's underworld. He handed the tapes over to Wallace Turner and William Lambert, investigative reporters for the Portland Oregonian. The result was explosive. Turner and Lambert's groundbreaking series on the criminal combine earned them the Pulitzer Prize, shining a spotlight on the corruption and criminality that had infiltrated Portland's leadership and labor unions. The revelations of corruption and debauchery beneath the veneer of Portland's urban administration exposed a sordid network that stretched from top-ranking officials to the hidden corners of the underworld, involving figures such as prostitutes and narcotics addicts. The Senate hearings unveiled that Frank Brewster and John J. Sweeney, the top officials of the Western Conference of Teamsters, were not only aware of their subordinates' drive to seize control of Portland's criminal enterprises, but actively supported it. The Teamsters' Treasury was used to bankroll the racketeers' operations, a brazen misuse of union funds. The investigation also implicated other Teamster officials in acts of gross misconduct, fraud, and flagrant misuse of union dues. Their collective efforts to dominate Portland's underworld exemplified a systemic culture of corruption within the union. The Portland hearings became the cornerstone of the larger probe into the Western Conference of Teamsters, led by Frank W. Brewster. This investigation marked the beginning of an unmasking of deep-rooted corruption within the Teamsters. Frank Brewster, closely emulating his associate and superior Dave Beck, dissipated nearly $800,000 from union treasuries and other funds. Among the scandalous practices revealed, Brewster used union dues to support his extravagant stable of thoroughbred racehorses. He purchased a luxurious apartment in Palm Springs, California, exclusively for the use of union officers. He spent $4,000 of union money as a down payment on a house for himself in Palm Springs. $440,000 of union funds were sunk into a failing Canadian trucking company under the guise of aiding its 90 union employees, but with no realistic chance of financial return for the Teamsters. The company eventually landed in the hands of a Washington state trucker who had not invested a single penny. Brewster and Beck co-owned a filling station that was given preferential access to Teamster business. Brewster also engaged in unethical dealings with a broker managing the Western Conference's welfare funds, creating a blatant conflict of interest. The Senate Select Committee determined that Brewster had mismanaged $849,309.98 in union funds, including the ill-fated loan to the Canadian trucking company. Brewster's testimony painted him as a careless, extravagant and untrustworthy steward of the union members' money. Yet, despite the damning evidence, Brewster's corruption paled in comparison to the exploits of his friend, leader and business partner, Dave Beck, whose unchecked greed cast an even darker shadow over the union's operations. Today, McClellan delves into the downfall of Dave Beck. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters staunchly maintained that no entity, not even the United States Senate, had the authority to scrutinize its operations or examine its files. James Riddle Hoffa, a rising force within the Union, openly dismissed the Senate's investigation. In a conversation with Washington correspondent Clark Mollenhoff, whose scathing critiques of the Union leadership had drawn national attention, Hoffa scoffed at the inquiry's potential. "Why don't you give up?" Hoffa taunted. "We're the Teamsters." Confident in the influence of money and the leverage it could provide, Hoffa added, "Everyone has his price. What's yours?" Dave Beck. His Majesty, the Wheel. At the time, James Hoffa had not yet ascended to the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. That role still belonged to Dave Beck, who had ruled the union since 1952, with a regal air, befitting his nickname, His Majesty, the Wheel, inspired by the Teamsters' official seal. In 1957, the Teamsters had risen to become the largest labor union in the United States, boasting a membership of approximately 1.5 million. Their reach was immense, controlling the transportation of nearly all raw materials and finished goods essential to American business and industry. This unparalleled influence gave the Union the ability to bring the country's economy to a standstill overnight, should they choose to wield their power. As Beck continued to evade the Senate's attempts to hold him accountable, his unchecked authority and lavish lifestyle became emblematic of the corruption that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Dave Beck was no stranger to the halls of power. He counted high-ranking officials in the national government among his friends, wielded significant influence in Congress, and had even posed for photographs on the steps of the White House, shaking hands with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Beck's endorsement of Eisenhower's presidential campaign was a national headline, cementing his stature as a political heavyweight. The Teamsters, bolstered by their immense power and prestige, enjoyed widespread public support as they entered the hearings of the Senate Select Committee. Millions of Americans, who had witnessed the rise of unionism as a force for fairness and respectability in modern times, found it difficult to accept that big labor could be riddled with corruption. Confident in their untouchability, the Teamsters considered themselves as powerful as the United States government. Hoffa, dismissive of the inquiry, mockingly referred to the hearings as McClellan's Playhouse 90, likening them to a television drama. This ridicule proved to be a grave miscalculation. Teamster leaders underestimated the resolve and integrity of the men arrayed against them. Cynical and dismissive, they disrespected qualities such as honesty, loyalty, and dedication, which were embodied by the committee's staff. The Teamsters, driven by their own venality, could not comprehend the possibility of someone fighting corruption purely out of principle. The question, "What's your angle in all this?" was often hurled at committee staff members, revealing the union leaders' inability to fathom the concept of an unyielding moral standard. On Tuesday, March 26, 1957, Dave Beck entered the Senate caucus room with his characteristic charm, appearing confident and affable. But as the committee's pointed questions began, the carefully constructed facade of Beck's respectability began to crumble. What started as a slow unraveling quickly turned into a torrent. By the end of the hearings, Beck stood exposed, no longer a leader of integrity, but a man who had betrayed the trust placed in him by the honest, hard-working people who had elevated him to power. His fall laid bare the stark image of a man who had stolen from the very union members he was supposed to protect, a betrayal that would resonate as a warning against unchecked power and corruption. Dave Beck's greed was not just grand in scale, but astonishingly petty. Among the purchases made with union funds were 6 diapers, presumably for a niece with several children. Eventually, Beck returned $370,000 to the Teamsters as restitution, but only after the Internal Revenue Service began to scrutinize his labyrinthine financial dealings. Records revealed that this money had been misappropriated for various purposes, including the construction of his home and the homes of 4 associates in Seattle. Additionally, $85,000 was paid to Nathan Shefferman, a labor relations counsel in Chicago, to cover personal bills for Beck, his son, and his nephew. Shefferman's testimony unveiled a web of underhanded dealings. Acting as Beck's so-called purchasing agent, Shefferman admitted to handling numerous personal expenses for Beck and his relatives. Bills were sent to Shefferman for payment, which Beck reimbursed using checks drawn from the Teamster Treasury. Beck's schemes extended beyond personal purchases. He received kickbacks from Teamster mortgages placed with a company in which he held financial interests. For example, on a land deal for the Teamsters' Washington headquarters, Beck pocketed $8,000 of Shefferman's $12,000 agent fee. Another notable kickback amounted to $24,000 when Shefferman oversaw the interior decorating of the Teamsters' international headquarters. Beck also pressured Anheuser-Busch, the St. Louis brewing giant, to favor a liquor distributing company whose president was none other than Dave Beck, Jr. The committee uncovered that much of the money Beck repaid to the Teamster Treasury had been borrowed from the Fruhoff Trailer Company, a major supplier of commercial trailers. While Beck repaid the loan with interest, part of the repayment came from funds he earned by selling his Seattle home to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters for $163,215, a house that had originally been built with union funds. Even after his retirement as president, Beck continued living in the house, underscoring the brazenness of his actions. Among the 21 findings by the Senate Select Committee was a peculiar scheme involving toy trucks. The Fruhoff Trailer Company and Associated Transport Company contributed $14,000, allegedly for industrial promotion. The Teamsters added $20,000, forming a pool of funds to create a company that manufactured and distributed toy trucks to Teamster locals across the country. The union spent another $20,000 on promoting these toy trucks, with Beck sending telegrams to push their sale. However, the campaign was met with dismal results. For example, Beck expressed frustration in a telegram about the St. Paul local union, noting a complete lack of engagement. If a special meeting of the council has not been called, or a special meeting of secretaries has not been called, please do so immediately, and advise me by wire or telephone this afternoon what is the matter in St. Paul. The campaign's failure became apparent, as Milwaukee's Joint Council 50 reported a mere 23 trucks purchased by its affiliated local unions. Beck's schemes, from toy trucks to real estate manipulation, painted a damning picture of a leader who betrayed his position and the trust of the union's members for personal enrichment. His actions, meticulously detailed by the Senate Select Committee, remain a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and corruption. Across the United States, Teamster locals averaged purchases of about 5 toy trucks per local, each adorned with the union emblem and priced between $15 and $30. But why was Dave Beck so insistent that every local order at least 5 trucks? The answer lay in a well-calculated scheme. The Shelton Company, which handled the toy trucks, generated a profit of $84,000 on an investment of $34,000. This tidy profit was split among Shelton Shefferman, the son of Beck's purchasing agent, Dave Beck Jr., and Norman Gessert, a cousin of Mrs. Dave Beck. Eventually, both Beck and his son faced convictions for larceny, and Beck himself was found guilty of filing fraudulent income tax returns related to a Teamster subsidiary. The outrage of Teamster members across the country reached a boiling point. Beck's misconduct forced him to withdraw as a candidate for re-election to the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In a symbolic act of rejection, members of a West Coast local burned him in effigy. At the Florida convention that year, Beck presided for the final time as Teamster president. In his farewell speech to representatives from across the nation, he reflected on his 31 years with the union and made a heartfelt request. I am going to ask you to judge me as I would judge you. I only ask you to try, if you possibly can, just here and there, somewhere along the line, to see if you can't find something I have done that is perhaps just a little bit over on the credit side. Just a little. To Beck's plea, the Senate Select Committee offered a definitive response. This committee can only conclude that the labor movement is well rid of Dave Beck, as it would be well rid of others like him. The public and the 17 million union members in America deserve better. As Beck's chapter came to a close, another was about to begin. Waiting impatiently in the wings was James Riddle Hoffa, a stocky, forceful figure who had been biding his time. Now, with Beck gone, Hoffa prepared to take center stage, ushering in a new era for the Teamsters, one fraught with its own controversies and challenges. Today, the focus shifts to James Riddle Hoffa and his ascent to power. James Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana. He was the son of a coal prospector who passed away when Hoffa was still a boy. This loss forced Hoffa to leave school at an early age and enter the workforce. His first job was as a stockboy in a department store. Then I got a job at Kroger's, and that's my whole life. pretty simple life," Hoffa once remarked. But Hoffa's life was far from simple. In 1932, he organized a union at Kroger's grocery chain, merging his group with the Teamsters. He rose quickly through the ranks, becoming president of Local 299 and immersing himself in the labor struggles of 1930s Detroit. Hoffa's leadership and tenacity were evident in his actions on the picket lines. On one occasion, he was arrested 18 times in a single day. It is unnecessary to recount all the committee's findings against Hoffa in exhaustive detail. His transgressions, spanning a range of corrupt practices, have been left for the courts to adjudicate. What remains undeniable, however, is Hoffa's shrewdness and forceful personality, which have allowed him to rise to prominence. Hoffa routinely dismissed the criticisms, indictments, and accusations leveled against him. He painted himself as the victim of a conspiracy, a valiant labor leader under siege by those who sought to weaken unions. His favorite refrain was that they are just picking on Hoffa in order to smash unions. But the Senate committee was unpersuaded. In its view, this narrative was patently false. The committee firmly believed that Hoffa's primary focus had always been, and continues to be, his own quest for power. The Senate Select Committee issued a stark warning in its report. If Hoffa remains unchecked, he will successfully destroy the decent labor movement in the United States. If Hoffa is successful in combating the combined weight of the United States government and public opinion, the cause of decent unionism is lost, and labor management relations in this country will return to the jungle era. When James Riddle Hoffa accepted the presidency of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters on October 4, 1957, in Miami Beach, Florida, he delivered one of the most significant speeches of his career. His address came just weeks before the union was expelled from the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO, for corruption. Hoffa sought to reassure the assembled delegates about his commitment to reform, stating, "We have taken action at this convention to comply fully and properly with proper ethical demands of the AFL-CIO." Less than a year later, Hoffa faced Senate questioning about his pledge to clean up the union. During his testimony, shocking allegations emerged, shedding light on the rampant corruption under Hoffa's watch. For instance, on the very day Hoffa testified, a minor hoodlum named Frank Keerdorf died in Pontiac, Michigan, from burns sustained while setting fire to a dry cleaning shop as part of a shakedown racket. Keerdorf had been accused of running a Teamster-backed extortion scheme in Flint, Michigan. Hoffa's response to the allegations? He had simply asked Keerdorf if the claims were true, and Keerdorf had denied them. Herman Keerdorf, Frank's uncle and another Teamster figure, was accused of extorting Detroit automobile dealers. A convicted felon who had served multiple prison terms before becoming a Teamster organizer, Herman was similarly questioned by Hoffa. Once again, Hoffa relied on the accused's denial as the basis for inaction. "I tried to find out from the only man that could have told me, Senator," Hoffa testified. The most egregious example of corruption involved Glenn W. Smith, president of Teamsters Local 515 in Tennessee. Smith admitted to using $20,000 of Teamster funds to bribe a judge in a criminal case in which he and 10 others were defendants. Remarkably, when Smith faced trial for income tax evasion, his lawyers argued that the $20,000 could not be considered income because Smith was merely a conduit for the money from union funds to the judge. Alternatively, they argued, if this defense failed, the money also wasn't income because Smith had embezzled it. In one of the most damning moments of Hoffa's testimony, Senator McClellan posed a pointed question about Smith's actions. The chairman put it to Hoffa, stating, "Mr. Hoffa, this is almost beyond comprehension, that a man will come in and admit that he took $20,000 of union money and state it under oath before a legal or properly constituted tribunal, the Senate of a sovereign state, acting as a trial court on an impeachment, and make that statement under oath that he took union dues money and used it to fix a criminal case to keep him from being convicted or going to the penitentiary, as likely he would have had he been convicted. Now, do you mean to say that as president of this great international union that doesn't cause you any concern to act, to protect your membership? Hoffa replied with, "Certainly it is disturbing news, but since there are charges filed, the due process will take care of the question of that." Hoffa's response epitomized his pattern of deflection and his reliance on the slow wheels of due process to shield his administration from immediate accountability. The hearings highlighted not only the corruption within the union, but also Hoffa's unwillingness to address it decisively. The Senate Select Committee delved into the murky dealings of Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, a vice president of Local 239 of the Teamsters and a notorious mobster with a long police record. Robert Kennedy confronted James Riddle Hoffa about Corallo's record. Kennedy: "He has been arrested 12 times, ranging from robbery, grand larceny, and narcotics. He was identified before the committee as an important figure in narcotics and a close friend of Johnny Diaguardi. My question is, have you made any investigation of him? Have you taken any steps against Mr. Tony Ducks Corallo?" Hoffa: "As of now, no." This response typified Hoffa's lack of action. The record continued with a litany of Teamster officials engaged in criminal behavior. Milton Holt, Secretary-Treasurer of Local 805, indicted for extortion, no action. Abe Gordon, Administrator of Local 805's Welfare Fund, accused of receiving kickbacks, no action. John McNamara, official of Local 808 and Local 295, jailed for extortion, no action. Shorty, Feldman, member of Local 990 with 18 arrests and 2 prison terms, no action. 19 officials of Local 107 collectively had 104 arrests and 40 convictions, led by Ray Cohen, Vice President of the International Teamsters, no action. Al Rieger, Secretary-Treasurer of Local 522, serving 5 to 10 years for extortion, no removal from office. Joey Glimko, Chicago-based member with 28 arrests, no action. Frank Matula, California official convicted of perjury, no action, pending appeal. Despite Hoffa's grand promises upon assuming the presidency, claiming the Teamsters would be a model of trade unionism, the reality painted a starkly different picture. One glaring example of corruption involved Glenn W. Smith, president of Teamsters Local 515 in Tennessee, who admitted to using $20,000 in union funds to bribe a judge. Hoffa deflected responsibility, claiming due process would resolve the issue. Hoffa himself stood accused of fraud for concealing his participation in the Sun Valley land scheme in Florida, where union members and their families bought overpriced lots. Over $2.4 million in union funds were found to be misused, including $174,870, paid to aid officials accused of extortion, dynamite and bribes, $150,000, loaned to a New York accountant with dubious ties to the union, $175,000, given to Marbury Construction Company, owned by Teamster employees, $1,200,000, invested in a Minneapolis department store run by Benjamin Drano, a Hoffa associate, which went bankrupt. Other flagrant abuses included $3,750, paid to union employees for work on a hunting and fishing club owned by Hoffa's wife and Mrs. Brennan. $5,000, spent to help a Philadelphia candidate run for union office. $155,000, used to purchase the former home of mobster Paul the Waiter Rika, allegedly for training Teamster employees. $5,000, paid to retrieve the runaway wife of Hoffa's brother Billy. The committee detailed case after case of Hoffa's inaction and corruption. One notable example involved Zygmunt Ziggy Snyder, a Teamster business agent and convicted felon. Snyder ran the Great Lakes Cargo Handling Company and the Fort Wayne Manor Car Wash, both rife with exploitative practices. At the car wash, non-union workers, including derelicts and teenagers, were paid far below union rates. Testimony revealed shocking conditions. Kennedy: "How much do you make a week approximately?" Waldlington: "About $6 or $7. Kennedy: "That's a 7-day week." Mr. Wadlington: "Yes, 11.5 hours a day." Despite Hoffa's claims of prioritizing the welfare of his members, the committee found he had repeatedly failed them. The committee's verdict. In its final report, the Senate Select Committee declared, "Time and time again, Hoffa has told the committee that no matter what else may be said about him, he is first and foremost interested in the betterment of the working conditions of his union members. Time and time again, the committee has found Hoffa to be faithless to the members of his own union." Today's article examines racial discrimination within James R. Hoffa's home locally and the far-reaching implications of his leadership. In Detroit's Local 299, a policy of discrimination barred African American drivers from operating over-the-road trucks. Witnesses, including Ross Hill and George S. Maxwell, testified about the devastating impact of this prejudice. Hill, an African American driver, recounted how discrimination forced him to sell his truck, car, and house. Hoffa himself was quoted as saying that Local 299 did not like over-the-road drivers of the colored race coming into Detroit and warned that their presence might not be healthy. Hoffa's rise to power also involved reshaping the Teamsters' democratic processes to stifle dissent. Long-standing barriers already limited the rank-and-file membership's ability to vote at national conventions. At the 1961 National Convention, Hoffa championed constitutional amendments that further entrenched power in the hands of local officers loyal to him, barring most rank-and-file members from participating in national decisions. Delegates to the National Convention had to serve at least 2 years in local office and attend 50% of union meetings. Local officers were automatically designated as convention delegates, leaving little room for rank-and-file representation. The Union Treasury was authorized to cover the legal fees of union officials accused of crimes, provided the charges were deemed unfounded or politically motivated. In addition, union dues were raised by $1 per month, pensions for officers were increased, and Hoffa's annual salary soared from $50,000 to $75,000. Hoffa sought alliances that expanded his influence, including agreements with Harry Bridges, leader of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. Bridges, widely regarded as having left-wing sympathies, formed a pact with Hoffa that posed a significant threat to labor management relations. Through a series of mutual assistance agreements, Hoffa envisioned a coalition of transportation unions capable of paralyzing the nation's economy. Such power could halt raw material shipments, disrupt foreign trade, and cripple military transport, giving these unions unprecedented control over the country's essential systems. The Senate Select Committee concluded that this threat to America's economic security was no myth, but a pressing reality. The committee urged Congress to enact legislation to curtail the dangerous concentration of power wielded by Hoffa, Bridges, and their allies. This is no fantasy, it is a fact. It cannot be tolerated with impunity. Congress must act to prevent this national disaster, the report declared, sounding a dire warning against the unchecked ambitions of Hoffa and his allies. Today's account reveals how 2 officers of the United Textile Workers looted their union treasury. Anthony Valente, President, and Lloyd Clennett, Secretary-Treasurer of the United Textile Workers, rose through the ranks of their union with apparent dedication. Both began as textile workers. Valente started in a plant at 13, and Clennett began work in a dye house in 1929. They joined the International Union in 1933, swiftly ascending to leadership, and by 1944 they had secured the top two positions. Once in power, Valente and Clenart consolidated their control over the union by manipulating constitutional provisions, rendering the 20-member Executive Council powerless to hold them accountable. Clenart, often seen as the leader of the pair, used the union treasury as a personal bank account. He spent over $60,000 of union funds on personal items, including a $783 discount on a 1955 Lincoln automobile, nearly $2,000 in personal expenses on a credit card, and exorbitant paid-out hotel charges totaling $30,000 over 3 years. Clenart's expenses were extravagant and carefully curated. He stayed at prestigious hotels like the Vanderbilt in New York, the Ambassador in Atlantic City, the Beverly Hills Hotel in Los Angeles, the Boca Raton Club in Florida, and the Princess in Bermuda. In Miami Beach, he frequented high-end establishments like the Balmoral and Eden Rock. The total hotel bills over 3 years amounted to $86,364, with cash advances, cabana rentals, golf fees, and miscellaneous luxuries comprising a significant portion. Among the purchases justified under a 1948 resolution to maintain the dignity and prestige of the union's leadership were a milk stool for $5.50, a golf lamp for $49.50, tickets to My Fair Lady totaling $2,564.65, covering 24 visits to the Broadway production. Clothing, including a black coat for $200, multiple dresses priced over $100 each, and lingerie for $12.50. Children's clothing, linens, and other household items charged to union funds. Clenart also took his family on many of these trips, with their expenses covered by the union. The scale of corruption was staggering. Investigators estimated that in just 3 years, despite earlier records having been destroyed, Valente and Clenart misappropriated $178,000, equivalent to 18% of the union's annual income. Even when forced to resign, they ensured lucrative severance payments for themselves, totaling $104,000. The American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO, intervened, demanding reform and the removal of corrupt officials. Though Clenart and Valente were ousted, their severance payments prompted the AFL-CIO to expel the United Textile Workers. To survive, the union pledged compliance with the AFL-CIO's ethical standards and restored its integrity, eventually earning reinstatement. This case stands as a powerful object lesson, underscoring the importance of vigilance and accountability for both labor leaders and rank-and-file members to ensure honesty and integrity within unions. Today's account reveals how arson was weaponized in Chicago's restaurant industry as part of a sprawling criminal racket. On the night of May 13, 1958, Andrew Millis and his cleaning crew arrived at Chicago's Fireside restaurant for their usual shift. Before long, 2 hooded gunmen disrupted their work. After herding the staff outside, the intruders set the restaurant ablaze, leaving behind a charred shell and a loss estimated at $1,400,000. The Fireside restaurant was one of many victims in a systematic racket operated by Chicago gangsters who targeted restaurant owners and employees through arson, violence, and intimidation. Investigators, including Laverne J. Duffy and James P. Kelly of the Senate Select Committee, uncovered a double-barreled protection racket that relied on both a corrupted union and a compliant restaurant owners association. The scheme was brutally simple: pay up or face the consequences. These consequences included over 40 major restaurant fires in an 18-month period, as well as beatings, slashed tires, stink bombs, and even murders. During 9 days of Senate hearings in July 1958, 39 unsolved murders were tied to this criminal network. At the heart of the racket was the control of local unions, particularly the Hotel and Restaurant Employees and Bartenders International Union, and the once respected Chicago Restaurant Association. The syndicate used union leaders and attorneys to orchestrate labor disputes, resolving them through bribery and payoffs. Workers were often unaware they were even unionized. Restaurant owners were coerced into paying initiation fees and dues for union members, many of whom no longer worked for them. On the other side, restaurant owners contributed over $1,100,000 to a voluntary fund between 1951 and 1957, intended to handle labor relations. Much of this money flowed into the pockets of attorneys Abraham Teitelbaum and Anthony Five Champagne, both linked to Al Capone's syndicate. Teitelbaum, who once served as Capone's lawyer, earned $125,000 annually as labor relations counsel for the Chicago Restaurant Association. Champagne, an attorney for Capone's associates, worked alongside him to orchestrate settlements through bribery and extortion. Both men refused to testify before the Senate Select Committee, invoking the Fifth Amendment. Despite Senate hearings and intervention by the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO, to clean up corrupt locals, most of the racketeers responsible for these crimes remained free. Only Paul Needle-Nose Labriola and James Weinberg faced fatal consequences for attempting to form a rival organization to the Chicago Restaurant Association. Their bodies were found stuffed in the trunk of a car weeks before the hearings began. The racket revealed the terrifying reach of organized crime, which infiltrated both unions and legitimate businesses. The syndicate's ability to control labor disputes and extort vast sums of money underscored the fragility of justice in the face of such entrenched corruption. While reforms were enacted, the hearings left a sobering conclusion. The architects of these schemes largely escaped justice, walking free to perpetuate their influence in Chicago and beyond.